wanted to make sure that was going to happen this time around. So Chairman Rogers and his team nationally have put together a group in South Carolina, Iowa, New Hampshire, and Michigan that are hosting forums like this. This is our first one in South Carolina, but it's the 5th one nationally. There were 2 in Iowa, Governor Perry and Senator Graham, and then they had 2 in New Hampshire with probably Fiorina and Governor Jindal. We're going to have our second one next month with Governor Perry. We'll be doing an event. We're going to actually do it in Beaufort. And we'll actually have another event in July that we're hoping to announce soon. We're just trying to nail down the dates before we let the cat out of the bag on who that's going to be. But our hope is to have candidates at different forums throughout the state and all over South Carolina as often as we can. So we appreciate you being here today. So our group, we've invited Dr. Brent Nelson, who is going to be our moderator today. He is actually one of our advisory board members and is a member of the Political Science Department in Furman. And so he drove down this morning with one of his friends from Greenville to participate in the event today, and we appreciate that. He is also the chair of SCETV and a member of the board of the National Corporation for Public Broadcasting. And of great interest for today is his focus is on the European Union, his academic focus. So hopefully we'll have some good questions about Greece and the EU today. And then our first guest for the forum today is Senator Rick Santorum. For those in the Citadel community, don't need much of an introduction for Senator Santorum. He and his family have spent enough time here in South Carolina that in 4 generations we'll consider him local. So his record in the Senate from 1995 to 2007 represented Pennsylvania in the U.S. Senate. Last cycle in 2012, ran for president, won the Iowa caucuses in 11 states, capturing over 4 million votes. He is once again running for president, and we are very excited to have him and Dr. Nelson here today. And without any further ado, we'll have them come on up and get started.
Well, Senator, welcome back to Charleston and the state of South Carolina. We're glad you're here with us. And we're particularly glad for all of you to come and participate in what is truly our civic responsibility, and that is to understand what the candidates stand for, what they're talking about, and in this particular case to have you talk a little bit about your foreign policy. We know that it's a very dangerous world out there, so these are important issues to consider. The Wall Street Journal this morning had a really interesting article on the Obama administration's recent reset of foreign policy, and I just wanted to read to you a section here that sets out the goals for the next couple of years. The Wall Street Journal reported today that after the 2014 elections, President Obama called for a, quote, blue skies assessment of all international policies worth considering. What emerged from that process was, quote, a sweeping and fundamental reorientation of U.S. foreign policy, highlighted by 4 initiatives. 1, conclude a nuclear deal with Iran. 2, renew diplomatic relations with Cuba. 3, elevate climate change to a national security issue. And 4, complete a free trade deal with Asia. So, would a Santorum administration adopt the same policy priorities? And if not, what would your priorities be?
Well, I would say that the first priority, the subject matter is a problem. Iran is not first, certainly very high up on the priority list of dealing with Iran. I think the President's approach to dealing with Iran, which seems to be headed toward capitulation of everything Iran is asking is maybe the most fundamentally threatening, fundamentally disruptive things that the President will do in American security history. I think he will, according to all reports we're seeing, that they've now sat across the table from the great sake, and they made our lunch, and gotten everything they needed to go back and do exactly what they were planning to do in the first place. Plus, had billions of dollars in this furniture building. It is reckless on the part of this president to put what is clearly a political priority ahead of the security interests of our country and the allies in the region. And I don't think just Israel, because you know, as you know, the Saudis are also looking at pursuing a nuclear weapon now. They cannot have a radical Shiite regime in possession of a nuclear weapon because they know full well that this is a regime that will proliferate and will use them. And the Turks will follow suit, and who else? Maybe others who have regimes in the region to be able to get those weapons. So not only are we going to jeopardize our friend Israel, but we are going to cause the proliferation of weapons in one of the most unstable, theocratically driven with a particular fixation on end of times theology. This is a very dangerous world that we're ushering into. And so the president's right, that is the highest priority. He's doing everything wrong in dealing with that priority.
So what would you do differently? By the way, I think is his mic on?
No.
Is the senator's mic on? I think maybe you need to.
Hello? Does that help?
Yes.
Okay, very good. Sorry. Yeah, the Santorum response would be the same response that I gave to George Bush back in 2005 when we began, 2006, I guess it was, when they began to talk about negotiations with Iran. I publicly came out and condemned the administration for doing so. This is a regime that has never kept a treaty, will not keep a treaty, has no respect for the rule of law or any type of rapprochement with the West. They see its weakness and they will exploit it. That's a fundamental understanding of radical Islam as I understand it. And if we do not confront it and eventually defeat it or push it back into its cage, then we will be confronted in increasingly virulent ways, as we've seen from the different iterations of radical Sunni Islam that started with the Muslim Brotherhood, and now we have ISIS. And with Iran, the answer is draw the clearest, brightest, boldest red line and put a timeline on that red line. And if they do not comply, then you ratchet up everything from sanctions to other options that are on the table. But at no point do you give them order to pursue this weapon, and because if you do, they will.
Is this an important enough issue for the United States to go to war over?
I think, I asked a former CIA director, what keeps you up late at night? This was a few weeks ago. And he said a nuclear law. And he gave the reason for that as, I said, well, what in particular? He said it's a proliferation through Hamas, Hezbollah, whoever other organizations, both Sunni and Shia, that they support. He said, of course, they could use these terror networks to deliver a variety of different nuclear weapons, dirty bombs, to something more sophisticated. But his big concern was an EMP. He said a nuclearized Iran with a nuclear weapon could easily launch a satellite, a weather balloon, or something lower, have it go around the world over the United States of America and explode in the upper atmosphere and knock out the entire electric grid of the United States potentially. They would not be above doing that any more than China is above going in and hacking our systems and attacking the United States directly today. There are all sorts of sophisticated attacks that the United States is vulnerable to. And we are doing, by the way, nothing to prevent, both on the cyber side, which we see almost incompetence on the part of the government, to an EMP, which could occur naturally through a solar flare or through an atomic weapon explosion. We've had plenty of opportunities to create redundant electrical grid backups in some things. We've done virtually nothing in that regard. So I am concerned that Iran will proliferate through terrorism and use it if they think they can do so effectively to disable it.
Is Iran different than North Korea?
Yes. And so when you have a defense philosophy of mutual assured destruction, it works because they don't want to die. The mullahs in Iran want to die because they believe that is the fulfillment. If they can accomplish what they want to accomplish, they are not living. If you read their speeches and look at their, remember President Ahmadinejad said that the highest virtue of the people's, the Islamic Republic of Iran, the highest virtue is martyrdom. So these are folks who have a very different philosophy of how they govern. They don't govern for the here and now, they govern for the hereafter. And so when you understand, for example, that a few years back they built a very elaborate road from a well in Jampuran in the city of Qom to the central square of Tehran. You say, what's the big deal that they built this very elaborate boulevard? Well, the well in Jampuran is where the 12th Imam is supposed to return to, who is their savior, to come back and lead them at the point to conquer the world. You may say, well, this is crazy. Well, okay, it may be crazy, but if they believe it, then we have to take them seriously about what they want to accomplish. And in fact, he did invest money for that very reason, to make sure that he had a grand entrance. They don't do Poland and Iran, but they do in Iraq. The most recent poll in Iraq, and again, Iraq is predominantly Shiite, at least the areas they're polling, the ones that are controlled that they can poll. And they asked the question, when do you expect the end of the world to come? In other words, for the Mahdi to return, the 12th Imam, the Mahdi. And it was 75% said within the next 5 years. Now again, you may say, well, that's just crazy. The problem is, the people who control the country believe this. It's not just the public that believes it, but the leaders believe this. And that's why there's such a threat.
Getting back to the priorities, would your second priority be Cuba, or would it be something else?
I would not have opened a relationship with Cuba. Cuba has been a cancer in Central and South America for the past 60 years, but even more acutely because of Venezuela. And the petrodollars that Venezuela had for a long time. The Castro-Chavez axis, before Chavez died, just proliferated the Bolivarian revolution throughout Central and South America. Overturned governments, disrupted governments, as we sat silently by under now two and a half to three administrations, and did nothing. Allowed them to spread this cancer, and to the point where even friends of ours are developing relationships with them because we aren't there to be supportive of them. We have to trade with them, we're not there to protect them. And so the entire region is going to see it, and this is our backyard. These are countries that we used to be able to trade with, that welcomed our participation in their economy, and increasingly they're orienting the work toward China, toward Russia, toward the Middle East, and abandoning us economically and geopolitically in our backyard. And when you look at the fact that now a majority of people coming across the border in Mexico are OTMs. You know what OTMs are? Other than Mexicans, that's who's coming across. Now it's mostly Guatemalans and Hondurans, but there's also a lot of people from other places around the world who are coming through. Why? Because of these relationships that are being built in Central and South America with China, with Russia, and yes, with Iran and other Islamic countries that are anti-American. This is Cuba, Venezuela, their axis, Nicaragua, and others who are specifically anti-American in their approach and are doing things to threaten and disrupt the United States.
So obviously Cuba's not your second priority.
Not my second. Well, it is a priority, but it's a very, again, 180 degrees from where this president's approaching.
So would the second priority have something to do perhaps with ISIS, or would it be out in Asia?
The president has created such a debacle internationally that there's almost, he's flattened the world that all of these have become higher and higher priorities. I mean, if you look at yes, ISIS is clear. ISIS is, by allowing ISIS to continue to establish a caliphate and be able to say to the Islamic world, we are the new caliphate. You have to, according to Islamic teachings, you have to follow us since we have declared the caliphate, we govern a piece of land, and we've called you to jihad. And so I think you saw today that the terror threat level is the highest it's been, since the days of 9/11. There's a reason for that, because we've allowed ISIS to exist. There's the idea that ISIS can call people from around the world and be established as legitimate is just dismissed by this administration as this is a small group of ragtag JV players, and that these people aren't really folks, they obviously do horrible things, and as a result of those horrible things, we have to look like we're doing something. That's the administration's response. The horror of what ISIS is, the crucifixions and the burnings and the beheadings and all of these, the drowning, all this horrible stuff. Obviously, no civilized nation can sit and do nothing in response to that, particularly a leader like the United States, who says they care about human rights. But the president is doing almost nothing. In fact, he's doing worse than that. Because what he's doing looks like we're fighting, but we're not. Looks like we're going to do something to defeat them, but we're not. Because we're not committing anywhere near the necessary troops or aircraft or intelligence or supplies to our allies in the region to be able to win that battle. And so we get the worst of two worlds. We get the commitment and the resources that are being spent there inefficiently. We're flying 14 to 20 sorties a day against the Islamic Republic. 14 to 20. Compare that to the Gulf War, we flew 800 to 1,000 a day. Of those 14 sorties, 70% don't drop any ordnance. Why? Because they can't get authorization. And we don't have sufficient boots on the ground to provide targeting that's efficient. This is the worst situation where we're putting the resources in there, looking like, telling the world we're fighting, not committing to winning, and ISIS is winning. They continue to advance and gain ground, so they get the added, remember, what is terrorism? It's psychological warfare. So they get the added psychological boost to the jihadis all over the world that they are taking on the United States and beating us. And so they're taking on the great Satan and winning the battle, maintaining the integrity of their caliphate by and large. This is supremely dangerous on the part of the United States. And again, we see little talk about this and how critical it is for us to take back land. That's the way you discredit a caliphate. That's the way you discredit the legitimacy of this caliphate, by taking land back. Because in the Islamic world, it is whether Allah, if Allah is blessing you, you win. If Allah is not blessing you, you lose. It's not a matter of what's right or wrong. There is no right or wrong. It's whether you win or whether you lose. That's right and wrong. And what we have is a situation where ISIS is winning, therefore Allah is with them, therefore jihadists, you must go. If we push back and we take these lands back, move them out of Iraq, then Allah obviously is not with them, and therefore there is no compulsion to join them. And this is a serious threat, not by just bringing people into Iraq and Syria, but also here in the United States to be mobilized to fight here. And so the longer we allow ISIS to flourish, I believe exponentially we will see more attacks here in the United States and throughout the world.
I'm going to ask one more question, and then we're going to go to questions from the audience. So what types of resources do you commit to defeat ISIS?
I would sit down with the leaders of the military and other strategists who have a clear head of what is necessary to accomplish this mission. I would try to work with others in the region, clearly the Egyptians, the Jordanians, the Kurds, the Saudis, all have Israelis, the Iraqis, all have an interest in defeating ISIS. You notice I didn't mention Iran. I would not work with Iran. I don't want any influence of Iran any more than it already has in the state of Iraq. I would do everything I can to get Iran out of Iraq in the process of doing this. Iran is a cancer, cannot be allowed to spread. It's ultimately a worse cancer, even I would argue, than ISIS, because they have a nation state that actually can acquire proliferate nuclear weapons. So I would work with the general staff and others to develop a plan that would be effective in defeating ISIS and using to the maximum extent. The Kurds want to fight, but we're not giving them the tools to. We're not giving them any of the heavy equipment that they need in order to take back that land from ISIS. That would change. But again, I can't sit here and say, I can tell you that we would support the Kurds, the Jordanians, the Egyptians, and others who would like to engage in the fight. We would have to put more resources on the ground and fly more air missions to help support those forces. But beyond that, I'd have to really get into more detail with the general staff to find out.
Okay. Well, let's go to questions from the folks in the room here, and thank you all for writing them down. Okay, so here's one about China. Some people see China only as an economic opportunity. How do you view China and our relationship with them? I'm a little skeptical, I being the person writing this, a little skeptical. What do you think and why?
I'm a lot skeptical. When you see China building islands in the South China Sea with a clear intent of claiming that entire body of water as Chinese territory and having the ability, because of their land-based systems, to make any kind of naval protection by the United States just impossible. You can't put a Navy in a place where there's ground-based weapon systems that can take them out. It's just an untenable position for the United States Navy to be in, and it's happened. I mean, I really get a kick out of the environmental movement in this country. I mean, they're worried about the snail darter, and yet they're building islands in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, right? And that's okay. We don't care if we disrupt the island, outside off the coast of China. I don't see Greenpeace doing circles around the islands and complaining about the natural disruption that's occurring with all these islands being built out there. All for military purposes, all for the purposes of controlling those waterways, which of course is a major artery of trade for all of Southeast Asia, as well as Japan, Taiwan, etc. So this is a huge, aggressive move on the part of the Chinese. And again, not being talked about, not on the top 4 priority list of this president. The president wants to talk about the Trans-Pacific Partnership, but you're talking about the major piece of water that the TPP is going to have to use, and they're going to have, and we're in the process of ceding that to Chinese control, where they can use that lever, which they will, for their economic benefit. So you can lower all the trade barriers you want. You can't get your ships through the shipping lanes. You're going to have a lot of problem being competitive economically, and I don't doubt that the Chinese are more than happy to create that difficulty for the United States if it becomes a problem. So again, the president has ignored this problem, has decided that he needs to spend his time talking to the Chinese about global climate change. It's really interesting that I saw this number the other day, I'm sure it's a well-published number, that if the United States accomplishes everything it wants to accomplish, which is an 80% reduction in emissions, 80% by the year 2050. So we reduce our emissions, our CO2 emissions, by 80%, which the economic, I won't even get into the economic calamity that would occur with an 80% reduction in emissions. But let's just assume we can do that. What would be the impact on the temperatures, worldwide temperatures, if America reduced their emissions by 80%? Answer, a decrease in climate temperatures of 0.1 degree. 0.1, which is a natural variant. 0.1, if we accomplished all this. And the answer is, well, then why is it that the climate's going to go up all this? How many people in the United States of America? About 300 million. How many people in India and China? About 3 billion. And those are societies that are growing much faster, industrializing as we speak, and not using any near the technology that we have to control emissions when in producing those industrial materials. And neither of those countries are going to do anything, let me assure you, about climate change. Because both of those countries are trying to survive and grow their economies from third world status to second and first world status. And so, for the president to spend all of his time on this issue, when there are, to impose this kind of restrictions on America, to spend his time trying to talk to these other countries, just like talking to Iran, have no intention of giving up their path that they've set forth for themselves. Whether it's Iran on nuclear weapons or whether it's China on industrialization, is again a folly, a president who is not dealing with reality. And the detriment is profound for the United States of America, for our security and for our economic well-being.
If I could follow up on that, because you entered into this climate change debate, do you think that climate change is a national security issue, or is it something quite different?
So the question is, on any type of issue, what what is the problem and what can we do about the problem, and what should be our priority. The problem is, again, if you accept all the science, which I do not, but if you accept all the science that began making prognostications, these dire prognostications back in the mid-90s, none of those prognostications in the next 15 years have occurred. It simply hasn't. All the models were all wrong so far. But if you assume they're eventually going to be right, then the question is, what is our response? Well, if our response is to deal with this national security problem, how do you deal with a national security problem? Well, you try to protect the United States. So how do you protect the United States? Well, you can try to do things, as I said before. You can put in an 80% reduction in emissions. It has no impact. It has zero impact. Nothing. It has no impact whatsoever. So what's your national security strategy? Your national security strategy, if this is indeed a national security problem, is to convince others to do something that is inherently not their best interest. Because I guarantee you, and just read what China and India say, they do not care about this issue. They have much bigger problems to deal with than climate change. And if we have any success in trying to convince China to do anything geopolitically, and the answer is no, zero, none. And so the idea that we put up a national security issue that is beyond the ability for the United States to control the outcome. It's not like we will, okay, well, if you don't do this, China, we're going to take military actions, or we're going to sanction you. I mean, it would be a joke if the United States said we were going to attack China because they're building steel plants. I mean, the world would laugh at that, in spite of the concern about climate change. There is no reasonable remedy that's available to us other than trying to cajole the Chinese and the Indians to do something that is not in their own economic security interest.
Some people suggest that maybe the free enterprise system can be used in some ways to ameliorate the effects of climate change. Do you have support that in any way?
If you accept the reality that China and India are the biggest drivers of this issue, I'm not too sure that there's anything the United States can do from a free enterprise point of view that's going to dramatically affect the behavior of China.
Okay, well, continuing with China, this one does follow on just slightly earlier. Do you think military confrontation with China is inevitable?
Well, I don't think military confrontation with anybody is inevitable. Particularly the Chinese tend to be more rational players than, say, in Iran. Because we've dealt with players like China for a long, long time, and we've been successful in dealing with those. We understand geopolitical power and the game that's been played during the Cold War for a long time. The new game in town is dealing with radical democracies that we don't accept to be the reason for their existence. When we deny the reality of who radical Islam is, then we eliminate the ability for us to respond appropriately to the problems. But in China, we understand how China functions. We understand their end game, and I think as a result of it, we have an ability to influence.
So you see them as more traditional in a geopolitical sense.
They are.
Okay, well, let's move to another part of the world we haven't even talked about yet, where we have maybe some similar conflicts, and that's Europe. In this question, would you support giving defensive weapons to Ukraine? What else would you do to stem Russia's influence?
I would say that we have obligations and treaties that we have agreed to, that if we're going to be a credible ally, someone that can be trusted, by the way, both by our enemies and our friends, when we fulfill our obligations under a treaty to an ally, we send a message not to our allies, but also to our enemies. allies. But it also sent a very clear message to Iran, a very clear message to Russia, that we were not going to live up to our obligations. We have now sent the president from almost day one. It was one of the first things he did as president. Almost from day one, without informing our allies. At least this is what the news reports was, that the Poles and the Czechs found out about this through news reports. We did not even have the respect of our allies to consult with them, to give them the opportunity to make their case. The president simply unilaterally decided to revoke this promise. And I would argue he sent even a more powerful message to Russia and Iran than he did to the Poles and the Czechs. And they have followed him. They said, okay, we now have someone who is not going to stand by promises, who's going to have a policy of reset and engagement, which means weakness in the eyes, certainly of the Iranians, potentially, probably in Putin's eyes too, and someone who doesn't feel compelled to stand by agreements and by our friends. And so, thus, Ukraine becomes a possibility. Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, all of this become possibilities. Why? Because we have not seen the president willing to really engage America's might and power to protect allies who are being threatened by other world powers.
So do we arm the Ukrainians?
Again, I can't say specifically what I would do as far as the types of arms, because I just don't have that. I don't have those briefings. But what I would say is I would, again, sit down with our generals, and yes, I would commit resources and military hardware as appropriate so Ukraine has an effective fighting force. I have some concerns about that given the nature of the Ukrainian army and how things are working. There are a lot of things moving on the chessboard there, that there are some rather unsavory elements involved in Ukraine who are part of the defense structure. So again, as it always is, it's not as clear cut as it might sound, but overall the answer is I would have and I will be much more aggressive in defending countries that we have treaty obligations.
Ukraine is certainly more complex and difficult, but there's been much talk recently about the fact that maybe Putin is not finished in trying to expand or reestablish a Soviet-style sphere. And of course, then the focus is on the Baltic states, which you already mentioned. Those are NATO allies. We do have an Article 5 commitment to them. So, do we put American troops on the front line if the Russians begin to infiltrate, try to take back the Baltics?
Well, this is a broader question for NATO, right? How effective is NATO going to be? How much, if you look at the other NATO countries, they spend virtually nothing on their military. And so you could somewhat make that argument given how most of the NATO actions in the past have sort of been on the periphery, if you will, of the national security interests of the countries involved in NATO, at least the major countries. When you talk about Russia creeping back into Eastern Europe, now you're talking about real security threats to Germany and to France and to others who are bigger financial players, and in the case of France, military players in NATO. So the question is, will they, with proper leadership from the United States, which of course it will require, would they be willing to step up and join us not just in words but in deeds? Well, both in words and deeds, because I'm not sure they're joining us either right now, but both in words and deeds. And that's a key part of whether the United States is going to. I think the United States making a unilateral commitment to those three countries without the support, broader support of NATO, would not be a wise or effective.
And of course, Greece is in meltdown mode right now as we talk.
And the impact. Look, I'm very, very concerned about Greece. I'm concerned about the debt situation in this country, not just the national debt, but now increasing personal debt. looked at, we've got a potential debt bomb happening here in the United States of America that, you always see this. I mean, you have a country that's halfway around the world that triggers something, and panic starts to roll. And if the panic starts to roll, as we saw in the market yesterday, if the panic starts to roll in any kind of meaningful way, America is not well positioned right now from a debt standpoint. We're not where we were just even a few years ago when personal debt was being paid down and balance sheets were getting in better shape. Now they're not. And so we could see some very rough times. I think this fall is one of those times I would just argue we need to be alert for as a country, because I think there's a real chance that another October can come and we can see some real economic downturn here in this country, markets and lending and the whole line.
Okay, one final question, and then we're going to let you wrap it up. So, yes, this is on cyber security. What is your plan? Actually, maybe I didn't read this closely enough. What is your plan to combat information warfare campaigns waged by both state, Russia, China, Iran, and non-state ISIS actors?
I've had a little experience with this in the private sector. I've been working with a company that does cybersecurity, and I actually sought them out because what I heard was some of the best technology out there. Because I'm very, very concerned about this, and from my experience so far in interfacing with the government on this, there are several huge problems. Number one is this is unlike any other type of warfare. It just cuts across in a way that no other type of warfare. Our defense systems are not structured for this type of attack. And so as a result, what I've seen is attacks where there could have been a response from the government, but because there aren't clear lines of authority of who's to act and who's to take control, no one does. And then you simply, because if somebody does and they don't, it's the way the government works. Well, you the government knows this. If some government agency actually takes authority, even though they may not have full authority because authority is so broken up, you have discrete lines of what you can and can't do. How can you reach outside the country? Can you only deal with things inside the country? All of these different jurisdictional stovepipes that what I've actually seen, is that the government could have stopped one of these attacks and simply couldn't, because no one would take the responsibility going forward, because it's better to have everybody be blamed for something not happening than for someone to step forward and try to do something and fail, and then you get the blame and everybody else is up. So you have this lack of coordination that I don't think we are doing anything, at least what I hear. We're doing very little. I know the president put forward, I think about 2 months ago, something to say, well, we need to start better coordination. And I even tweeted out, that's something we need to do. But everything I've heard since then is it's not real. This is a huge problem that cuts across defense, homeland security, little fiefdom to control them, and no one has responsibility. And again, this is a dangerous thing to do because you're getting some responsibility over all of this. This is why the government is not the best place to do things, because it just, when it comes to these very complex interagency problems, it's perilous. So I would argue that I haven't laid out a plan. We're working on something to see how we can better respond to it. Secondly, and more importantly, how do we detect these things before they? How are we able to do that? And again, I think that's probably a technology issue, and I do believe there are technologies out there that can help us do that. And to the extent that we can detect them and block them before, again, get an agency that's willing to actually act and do something, that we can give authority to and have information flow to actors or actors within the government to be able to respond. Then I think we can begin to deal with this.
Well, there are many other questions out there. asking, but we have kind of toured the world today. So,
Are you tired?
that's been very good. And I'll tell you, I would love to have you come to my class up in Furman at some point, because you've really gotten the issues out there. A lot of people would be very, very informed in what those are. So I appreciate it.
I know, my son goes to Citadel, I don't know if I can go to front.
Yeah, I know.
It's a little dicey.
There's some good stories, though, between Furman and Citadel. We have to talk about those later. But we're going to give you the last 10 minutes. We need to be done at 1:30, so you have 10 minutes.
Thank you. Well, I should introduce my son John. He's back. He's a senior at the Citadel. So John, say hi. His brother is a junior. He's not here, so he doesn't. Like I said, thank you very much. Appreciate all of you coming out on a beautiful Charleston Tuesday afternoon to be with us. I'm glad to see it was mentioned earlier that there was one debate on national security, and that frustrated me because 4 years ago when I was running, I mean, I knew the threats that radical Islam were not on. I knew that bin Laden is dead, everything is fine, was a lie. I knew that the president's decision to withdraw those troops out of Iraq was going to be a devastating blow to the security of Iraq and to Americans' interests in the Middle East. I talked about all those things. I talked about, at the time of the Syrian revolution, of engaging in Syria and to actually support the pro-democracy movement in Syria at the time when the pro-democracy movement was actually pro-democracy and pro-Western, which the remnants of that really don't suggest that it is anymore. It was a big issue, but it was not an issue that was on the front burner. That probably was not to the benefit of the Republican nominee for president, in the sense that when national security issues are not on the front burner, people tend to look inwardly, and that doesn't necessarily benefit the Republican Party. Because the Republican Party should be, has been, hopefully will be, the party that is trusted by the American public to keep it safe. That they do what I said Barack Obama has not done over the last 10 years, which is look at the world through realistic eyes, not through rose-colored glasses, and as he does with domestic policy, through an ideology that doesn't work, and tries to continue to do things, even though it doesn't work, continues to pound forward with this ideology that is, in my opinion, destructive of international security as well as this country. This is an opportunity to have an election about national security. The issue here is that we're going to be going up against, in all likelihood, a former Secretary of State, someone who has a tremendous amount of experience in this area. You say, well, she has a lot of baggage. She does. When it comes to maybe the worst record of any Secretary of State in modern history, hitting the Russian reset button to blow up the situation in Eastern Europe, and the disastrous relationships we have in the Middle East, particularly with Israel now, getting it wrong on Egypt, getting it wrong on a whole variety of other areas, and of course, the issue of Libya and Benghazi, and a whole host of other issues that the Secretary of State has indeed gotten wrong, and will have to account for. But she's the Secretary of State who's very knowledgeable. And I just have you recall what happened back in the debate in 2012. There was a national security debate between the President and Governor Romney. Governor Romney had made some good points, but President Obama pushed back on those points, and Governor Romney seemed defeated every time. Not just once, but every time. Even when Katie Crowley pushed back, he seemed defeated. And there's a reason for that. The gentleman up here I was talking to is in the real estate business. Now, yesterday I was reading the paper, or maybe it was 2 days ago, I was reading about article of real estate. And I could have gone in and said to this gentleman, I said, hey, I understand real estate business in this area of Charleston is really doing poorly. He'd look at me and say, what are you talking about? I said, and he'd go in chapter and verse and say how wonderful real estate is in that area. Now, what am I going to do? Am I going to say, no, you're wrong? No, you don't understand your own business that you've been at for 20 years? No, you're going to back off. Why? Because your knowledge is a briefing book. Your knowledge isn't experience. Your knowledge is that you lived it, you fought those battles, you worked those battles, and you in fact understand them just as well as she does. Because you lived them. That's why I always say in my speeches that Commander-in-Chief is not an entry-level position. And this is a very serious
issue for America going forward. But it is also a very serious and important issue for the politics of winning this race. We need to have someone who can stand up to a former Secretary of State and be able to articulate a very fundamentally different vision for keeping America safe, and do so with knowledge and confidence. And I would just make the argument that if there's any time that we need to look at someone with national security experience, extensive national security experience for this race, I will tell you that one of the former, well, he's now very close aide to Prime Minister Netanyahu. Less than a year ago, when I was in Israel, he pulled me aside from a meeting and said, "Senator, I just maybe running for president. I just want you to tell the American public that they are in all likelihood going to be electing a president who's going to have to be a wartime president. And I'm talking about a serious war, not a war. And that they need to prepare to elect someone who can handle that job." So this is a big deal from a national security point of view, to get the right choice for president. But it's also a big deal to be able to win the election, because we have to have someone that the American public can trust at a time when I don't know what the economy is doing. I have a pretty good chance, a pretty good understanding, a pretty good sense of what the international world is going to look like. And it's not going to be pretty anywhere. And it's going to be top of mind, if not the very top. And national security is usually not the very top, but it's going to be close to the very top. We better have someone prepared to do that. I would say that if you look at my track record, you've heard the discussion, but I served 8 years on the Armed Services Committee. I was subcommittee chair all 8 of those years. I worked on national security legislation, everything from bills on Iran and Syria to issues of Central Europe and other areas around the world. I spent 4 years after I left the Congress running for a think tank on national security, a program we call the Gathering Storm of the 21st Century. Because I believe, and I have believed now for the better part of 10 years, that we are reaching that storm. There's no storm that's, you say, well, the Gathering Storm, you're alluding to Churchill. Yes, I mean, that's clearly the illusion. It's not the same. They're never the same. But it doesn't mean that forces are not aligned and seeing the opportunity for evil to prosper with the United States on the retreat, economically as well as militarily. And Europe, by and large, affects us in every way, economically, morally, culturally, and politically as well as militarily. There is no one standing in their way. That's the way they look at it. And there's no one standing in the way of evil. Evil will prosper. And that opportunity is being opened up by this president. He's giving them all of the signals that it's time to take advantage of this opportunity. And toward the end of this presidency, the presidency is diminished, and it's already seeing the diminishment of this president. You're going to see those elements rise and engage, and that's why not just me but others, like I mentioned in Israel, see the future as not one that we can afford to try for. And so I would just say, I hope you get an understanding that these are issues that I've thought about a lot for a long time. I've dealt with them a lot for a long time. And I have some very clear ideas about how to solve these. I will tell you this. 2 months ago, I was featured in an online magazine, which is generally a good thing. But this online magazine was the online magazine of the Islamic State, ISIS. I was in their English online edition. It was under the headline, "In the Words of Our Enemies." It was a picture of me and a quote that I put up, that they quoted me from, that talked about the nature of this enemy and why we had to defeat them. It's interesting to note the president is not listed under the enemies list of the Islamic State. But I am, and the reason I am is because they know me. I guarantee you the Iranians know me. ISIS knows me, and I know them. And in the next president, you're going to want someone that the enemy knows, and the enemy fears, and that our allies know, and that our allies trust. And I think that's one of the things I bring to the table in this election, and that's why I ask for your support. Thank you.
more forums like this with all the different candidates throughout the state. And actually hope Senator Santorum will be joining ABPS in Iowa and New Hampshire for similar forums. I hope everybody sees the value in doing events like this and participate in our future events. Feel free to follow us on Facebook and on Twitter for updates